Hello, my name is Rhonda Bender, and today I'd like to try to make a video version of the kinds of articles I write over at my miniature painting website, birdwithabrush.com. I had a recent experience where I painted something I wasn't very happy with, and I know that's not an unusual experience and that lots of you have had that too, so I'd like to talk to you about how you can take that experience and turn it into something useful going forward. So I'm going to switch to my miniature view camera now. So I have some miniatures here that hopefully will help me make the point that I'm talking about. So this is the figure that I painted recently that I wasn't very happy with. And it's not actually fully painted. I've done additional steps on these figures that I didn't do on this one. So what happened is I'm working on miniature painting class for an upcoming online event called Reaper Virtual Expo, and that's March 5th to 7th, 2021, and I'll put a web link somewhere here so that you can find out more about that if you're interested. But so I was trying to pick a color scheme so that the people who attend the class can use the same colors that I do if they want to. And I wasn't very happy with this one, and I did some more experiments, and I've ended up picking up different colors, but it gave me the opportunity to sit and think about problem solving and how we approach things that don't work out very well. So I think trying to use a problem solving approach is going to be more healthy and help you in painting in the future. So sometimes I talk about that on my blog. I've had one series called Problem Solving, and I've talked about it in other articles that I've written, and that usually relates to a figure that I'm painting and I'm working on fixing something I identify as a problem in that figure. So if you go through some of my blog articles, there will be work in progress photos that kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. But sometimes you can, finish something and not be that happy with it, and you don't necessarily have to fix that thing, but it can still be worth studying it to get information to take to painting the next thing you paint and the thing after that. So I want to kind of walk through the mental process that I went through in trying to do that with this figure. So briefly, we'll look at these figures. This is the easiest comparison to make, if you can do it, which is looking at the same exact figure with the same exact color scheme, and I've just changed other variables. So this is something I painted quite a while ago, and I've tried to paint a better recent version of it, which actually I'm not happy with this figure, and this is going to become an illustration of some various other points about miniature painting that I hope to make, but I have to paint one or two more of these to make all of the points. But the only way to really do this kind of comparison is to paint something again, or to paint something to copy somebody else's figure, which is an excellent way to learn. When I say copy, I don't mean that as a negative thing. In traditional art, which I also study, they call that making master copies. So you take something an artist you like has done, and you try to copy it, and you try to figure out how they did that, and you can learn a lot through that process. And you can do the same thing in miniature painting. Anne Forster of Painting Big has talked about doing that, and other painters as well. And sometimes you can just do a portion of that. Like if you really like the non-metallic metal on something, you can try to paint the same figure with the non-metallic metal and then paint the other areas differently. But the more you make it identical, the easier it is going to be for you to compare. I mean, you could look at this, and eventually I'll have photos up of this and say, okay, what are the differences between these two figures? And that gives you information to work from. But most of the time we're doing something more like these, where you might be able to find things that are similarities, but there's always going to be a little of apples to oranges going on. So in this case, I have two figures that are the same sculpt, but they're different color schemes, and they were painted with different painting techniques. And I think we can see a little more from the back in some ways. And then I have these two figures are similar color scheme, but different sculpts. But they're all figures with scales. There are commonalities. I'm not comparing things that, I'm not comparing apples and automobiles. I'm still in the fruit family. So this kind of thing, building your critical skills this way and then starting to apply the same idea to something while you're painting it, is a lot of how you get better, particularly after a certain point. When you've got techniques kind of under control, that's not to say that you aren't still improving techniques in your dexterity and all brush control. But at a certain point, building your critical eye, figuring out what you're doing wrong, what's different from what you're doing compared to what other people are doing that you like, is how you start getting better. So in the case of these two figures, this is seeing the difference that, high contrast of darker shadows and brighter highlights can make. And there are issues with this figure. There are things I got wrong. And that's why I'd like to do yet again another version. But this is still a more visually effective figure than this one because of that type of contrast. The exact kind of contrast that we are often told to do more of in our hobby, and this is an example of why we are told that. But anyway, sorry, I digressed a little there. And now I have to kind of try to remember where I was. Okay, so I was talking about building your critical skills and being able to judge your own work. Now, our temptation is to look to other people for critique and for answers to what we're doing wrong. So we'll post something on Facebook or your favorite forum, or you'll come to an event like ReaperCon and ask for feedback. And those are useful things to do. It is useful to get critique from other people. It's the only way to really try to see your work through other people's eyes. But it's not useful to rely on other people to give you the answers. I mean, one problem is just you're not going to find people who have enough time and energy to give you all the information that you need. And the other reason it's not good to rely on is they don't have all the answers. Even very experienced painters that you admire don't necessarily have the answers. I could show this to a lot of painters I admire, and they may or may not come up with what the problems are. They might have ideas for what I could do better. Actually, I'm going to give you this example. So I'm a pretty good writer because, as I mentioned, most of what I do is writing, actually, over on my blog. And I went to school for editing, but I never actually learned grammar. When I went through school, they didn't teach it. Most of the grammar I learned was from French teachers trying to teach us French because they had to tell us what a verb was before they could teach us French. So I have a very intuitive sense of grammar. And this is, you think of, a lot of people think of art as being an intuitive or an innate thing, and you're either a good artist or you aren't. But it's a lot more like the grammar than you think. There are some people who have an innate sense, and there are other people who have studied and learned and applied and figured out how to get better at it. So going back to my analogy, I have more of an innate sense of grammar. I can't take a sentence and diagram it. When I edit something, there are times when I can't fix the sentence as presented. I can write a correct sentence. I can take that information and write it a different way and make it correct, but I can't necessarily fix the sentence of the writer. And you'll find a similar thing in the visual arts, where another painter could say, well, I can take those colors and make that figure and make something that looks good, or I could take different colors in that figure and make it look good. But they wouldn't necessarily be able to take this figure and figure out exactly what's wrong with it and how you make it better. They may tell you things they think are wrong. I mean, you'll get people who say, well, this is the problem, or you need to do more of this. They're not always right. Just because somebody tells you that on your Facebook post doesn't mean they're right. They're right that something's off about your figure or that something's not appealing to them. They aren't necessarily right about what the solution is. So learning to do some of this for yourself is useful because you'll get better at, yourself the best. You know what you're trying to do the best, and you are always available to yourself. So you are a resource that you should not squander. So that's why I'm advocating for you building your own critical skills by doing exercises like this. And then also not to beat yourself up, because I could have just said, well, that's terrible, I'm a horrible painter, and I don't know what I'm doing, and been frustrated and upset about that. and that wouldn't have accomplished very much. What I did instead was a lot more productive for me. So this is still terrible, but maybe we can fix it. So when you can't do this, you can't compare the apples to apples, and we're working with apples to oranges. Well, how does that work? So this figure, I actually thought I was picking colors that were kind of similar to what I'd used on this, but I was lazy and I didn't go get this out of my case and look at it when I did that. Just to look at the front for a minute, there are some areas that are kind of reddish brown. So that's what I was remembering, I guess. It's been a minute since I finished this. But obviously my memory was not very accurate. I mean, I guess I was kind of remembering the reddish brown of that and then sort of the yellows of the other parts. But there's a big difference between these two figures in that I painted this one with different techniques. I used wet blending and layering, and I painted in the crevices, the lines between the scales. I didn't use dry brushing and washing on this figure. I did use dry brushing and washing on this figure. So that's an important piece of information that I have. I use different techniques. When that color scheme failed, I worked up this figure, and that's what I'm going to use in my Reaper Virtual Expo class, those colors. But then the next day, I wanted to continue to work on this problem. Like, what did I do wrong here? Can I not paint an orangey red snake? So I changed up my colors a little and I painted this figure. So this is another data point that I have. And perhaps I might have had another figure that I'd already worked on. We can imagine it that way, that you look for something that you've worked on or that someone else has worked on that's similar to use as a point of comparison. So there's some differences, there's similarities between these colors, but there are differences too. So this gives us another data point we can approach looking at this. And there's one thing that I want to mention about doing this kind of exercise that I don't think I mentioned up front. This can take a minute. So I didn't just sit down at my desk and figure this out in 10 minutes. I painted this figure, I painted that figure the same night, then I worked on that figure the next day, and I kind of knew I wanted to talk about this, so I was thinking about it over a period of a couple of days. I put them all on a shelf that I walk by a couple of times a day that's at eye level, so that I could kind of stop and look at them and think about the problem. And when I'm working on a miniature, I have that place where I put it so that I have chances to look at it when I'm away from my paint desk, when I'm not in work mode, so I can be in critical eye mode and think about whether it's working right. And that's often when I will catch that, oh, there isn't enough contrast on that, or that color doesn't quite work with this. And those are some of the kinds of things that I brought up in the blog articles. So in this case, I'm kind of giving you a summary of thought processes that took place over a couple of days. And I'm practiced at doing this. So it may take you a little longer. It may be something that you have to experiment with more. But just give yourself time. It doesn't seem like it's directly related to painting, but this kind of thing is very helpful and can level up your skills quite a bit. And this, when I said it took a couple of days, it took a few minutes here and there over a couple of days. It didn't take, me sitting, thinking, having deep thoughts for 2 days. So now I want to talk through what I think the problems are and how I could solve them or treat them differently. I think it would be difficult to fix this miniature. I might give it a shot and we'll see what happens. But I certainly have some ideas for how I could approach it differently. So I think the root issue is the color selection. These are the colors that I picked for the figure the first time. Hopefully you can kind of see those. I should have swatched them out, but I didn't. They look like they should work on paper. But the issue is that this color, it seems like a red. So this is a reddish brown, this is an orangish brown, and this is a yellowish brown. So they're all kind of, they're colors that should work as a shade highlight, mid-tone, because orange, red, yellow, that's a family of colors that would work together for a shade, mid-tone, and highlight. But they're and they look like they're the same saturation. So saturation is how intense or pure a color is. So this is a very saturated red, and this is a less saturated red. So this is kind of like a cherry red, and this is a brick red. So I thought that these were all kind of like this. They were a little browned, a little dulled versions of those. But when you thin this color down and turn it into the wash, it turns out to be a lot more red than I thought it was. And a more saturated color is particularly likely to be a problem in shadows than in other parts of in areas that are receiving light. Because if you think about it, shadows are not only darker, but they're also duller because the light's not getting in there. So the photons or whatever aren't bouncing out, and we're not seeing the colors as much. So I think this is particularly problematic because the shadow color conflicts with the saturation level of the other two, and it's worse because it's the shadow color. So there's this red everywhere, and it doesn't look right. So one thing that I could have done, or could, if I wanted to do a color scheme similar to this on another figure, is I could just take a color that's more of a brown. It's a brown with a little bit of a red in it, and I would be willing to bet, and maybe we can test this in a minute, that this particular color scheme would work better than this did. The other approach is what I did on this figure, which is to increase the saturation of the other colors. So on this figure, I used this Numeria Rust, was kind of the mid-tone. Then I put in a wash of this ruddy leather. So this is a reddish brown, but it has less red in it than this one. And again, this is the kind of thing that's not obvious in the bottle, but when you thin paints down, sometimes the way we do for washes, you start seeing undertones of color. So you can see that a little more red comes out here than you see. This isn't a great example, but you've probably seen this. You'll have colors that you think are close to black, but when you thin them down, they're actually quite vivid blue or something like that. So in in this particular mix of colors, which is what was used on this snake, the mid-tone and the highlight colors are more saturated, and the shadow color is less saturated. And there's a darker shadow again. Well, actually, hold on. So I put in additional dark shadows, but they weren't a wash. So that's why I'm not including them in the thing. Because the problem with this is it's a wash and it's on everything. That's how washes work. So a different selection of colors that's more saturated would work. Using a shadow color that was less saturated would work. And I think there's one more possible thing that would work to solve this problem. And that is if I use these same colors, but I use them with these other techniques where I'm not applying the red all over everything, I'm only using it in the shadows, I suspect I could make this work. I might have to bring in a few additional colors, or kind of do some other things. I mean, it's not obvious in this figure. I think you can kind of maybe see it a little bit from there, but there's a lot of green. Actually, there's like a blue-green in the shadows of this. So there's all kinds of stuff I do with color when I'm working with these kinds of techniques that probably wouldn't work with, washing and dry brushing. So that's actually another thing I think is useful about this experience for me to share with you. And that's we tend to think of these as tabletop, simple, easy techniques. It was not that easy for me to pick colors just off the bat. And part of that may be that I don't use these techniques a lot. But part of it is that you may be undervaluing the skill level that you use when you successfully do tabletop miniature painting. It is a different technique. And that's something to keep in mind if you start trying to do different techniques. It may be that colors you're used to working together don't work together as much, or that you have to tweak them a little or add another little color or something else like that. What we're doing is a complicated thing, and we've got a lot of balls in the air, and it's not fair of us to get really down on ourselves when everything doesn't work exactly to plan. It's better to think of that as a learning opportunity and what we could do to work on that. So now I'm gonna bust out some paints and maybe try to test some of these theories a little bit and see how that goes. I'm back. So I have two theories, and now I have two snakes. that I have done a base coat mid-tone on painting on of the same color, and it's probably not even that apparent that this was the base color I used on this snake. So it's possible that another problem with my wash color is that it was a little too dark. But we're going to proceed with my previous testing ideas and see where we are. So I'm kind of working this out on camera for you. I'm not suggesting that you have to go paint 2 other figures to test a theory. You can paint parts of figures. You can, try stuff out on your next figure. You can also do tests before things go wrong. So this is when I wanted to paint this Snake Man with kind of a revised version of that initial color scheme I had been trying. This time I did a test of my wash colors before I applied it to my real figure. So I coated the wings in this mid-tone orange, and then I did 4 different potential wash colors. And then I dry brushed over top of that with the mid-tone color again. So I could see which color was most pleasing, which shadow color was most pleasing with my chosen mid-tone color. And by shadow color, I mean wash. These were washes. And I ended up choosing this one as the one I liked the best. But you might look at this and like another color, another effect more. There's not always a right answer to questions involving color. But this is just this. I use figures to test colors all the time. I mean, that's one of the things I love most about Bones, is I used to have 2 or 3 metal figures that I would use for these tests, and now I can go find Bones figures that share elements in common with the figure that I'm trying to paint. In this case, it was feathers instead of scales, but it's still kind of similar, and do quick tests. And yes, it's a little time to devise and find the figure and do the test, but it's less time than completely, I think that really the only way to fix this snake would be to repaint this snake. This is a lot quicker than that. But I might have a go trying to fix him after we test some of the other theories. So my first theory was that the problem is my wash color, that this wash color is too red, and now I'm saying it might possibly be too dark as well. And that's a lot of what I didn't like about the other snakes. So we're not going to use this wash color. We're going to use this more brown one that I said was similar. So I think the value is pretty similar. It may even be darker. I don't think I have anything else that I like better on my desk. But so the sensible thing for me would to do a little quick test like this. But I'm going to just apply it to the whole thing and see what we get. So I actually like to keep my blister packs to do washes in. I also have some porcelain palettes and plastic palettes that have the wells are nice for doing washes because then I don't risk making a big mess on my wet palette. And then also this is recycling, so that's nice. Well, reusing. Reusing is even better than recycling. So for a wash, you can mix a wash with just water. If you have problems with rings or anything like that, you can add a drop of this flow improver, or you can use, if you don't like how watery washes can feel, you can use a mix of brush-on sealer and water, which is essentially what this is. The wash medium is a mix of brush-on sealer, which is mostly the medium part of paint, the binder part of paint. So not the color, but everything else. And then this is a mix of that and water. So I'm going to put in a little drop of the flow improver. And this snake is actually quite large. I'm not probably going to be able to paint all of it, but I'm going to paint the wash on all of it. Because if you don't do a wash all at the same time, you'll see where the wash left off when I try to fix it. So I am going to add just a little bit of this brush-on sealer. You don't have to. I have thinned washes with just water, and that's what this is. And then let's mix that and see where we are. So because the snake is so big is why I have a fairly large amount of paint in here. For most washes, you don't have to use this much paint. So because I use that brush on sealer, it's not going to be as watery fluid in appearance. I'm going to have to test, and I recommend doing this kind of test anyway. That's in fact what these are, was me testing washes. Because you want it to be, you know, somewhat transparent, but also somewhat add color. So I feel like that's still too much color. It's going to cover over too much of my base coat. So we're going to add more water. So this is also, I mean, there's a lot of things that after painting for 17 or 18 years or whatever it is, I can just tell on my palette if the consistency is right or stuff like that. But washes and glazes, I really do this paper test all the time. So you can see that it's a bit more transparent now. You can see more of the text through it. I'm going to add just a little bit more water. With washes and glazes, you can always do another coat or add a little more paint and make it darker if it's not dark enough. But it's once the paint is dry, you can't take it off. So I tend to err on the side of underdoing it than overdoing it for washes. So I'll just do one more little test. Yeah, I think that's a lot better. So this is my answer to the, you know, another left brain analytical thing is you'll be like, well, how many drops do you put? How many drops of water do you put when you want to make a wash? How many drops of water do you use for glaze? Some paints are much more opaque than others. There's no one answer. You get the it depends answer. This is one of those areas where you get the it depends answer. So I use a test. Instead of asking for a formula, I know my end result, what I want, you know, the kind of consistency I want to see visually, and I test for that. So you can be analytical and scientific and use all of your left brain skills with painting. It doesn't have to be a you intuitively understand art thing. Okay, so now I've mixed the wash. I'm going to apply it to the figure. I have a fairly large brush. I would actually be perfectly happier if I even had a larger brush, so I think I'm going to use this one because he's a big figure. And you know, I want to get all the areas covered in the wash before it starts to dry, so that I don't, you know, unintentionally leave marks that I don't want to see on the figure. So washes and glazes are techniques that do kind of, you have to do it at a certain speed. I mean, it's not, you know, this is, as long as this is shiny, it's wet, and if I come back over, it's not the end of the world. But you can see where I was starting to pick paint up. If my brush is too dry, I'm going to pick paint up instead of putting paint down. So that's why, you know, it's good to not go over the areas if you can avoid it. But definitely, if you see a space that you miss, like, you know, catch that. Anyway, you guys probably know how to do washes better than I do. Since, as demonstrated, I'm not great at this. I meant on the figure that didn't work out that well. So hopefully I'm doing a decent job of keeping him in frame. I don't think he's in focus all the time, because he's quite a large figure, so there are going to be times when parts of him are further away from the camera or closer to the camera and be more or less in focus. So there I added a little too much wash. I can just pick it up with my brush and kind of move it to another area. But you see, I started at the head and I'm working my way down. And I like to do that with washes and glazes, work from one, you know, pick one starting spot and work to the opposite area. And not keep my brush moving over parts that I've already covered. So I've got, this is a little depression, so it's making almost too much of a puddle of paint. If you get a bubble, just try to pop it with the end of your brush. So now I'm looking for places where it's pooling a little more than I'd like. And then the downside of washes is you're going to have sections where it doesn't pool as much as you want. So like it might not fill in all the scale details in some places just because the physics, physics keeps drawing the paint to this section. It can help, a snake is a very, it's a cylindrical object, but if you have a figure that's kind of more front and back, I will often do the wash on the front area and kind of hold it like this for a minute, and then once it's started to dry, flip it over and do the wash on the other side. So while this dries, rather than using my hair dryer, I'm going to start testing the other theory. So the other theory is that if I used more of a wet blending layering type approach with these colors, it might look better. So here's my mid-tone. I'm going to kind of mix. This is my original shadow that I used on the snake I don't like, so I'm going to mix it half and half. And I'm just going to put out a lot of paint so I don't have to stop in between. And shake your paints a little more than I'm doing here. I don't want to make unattractive noise on the camera, and I know that I used all these paints recently because of painting that other snake. And that's not quite light enough, so I'm going to add this color to the top, because I think I went a little, there was a little higher contrast range between my darkest and my lightest color on the snakes that I liked how they turned out. And that's maybe a bit too light, so we'll make another middle one. So again, this is quite a large snake. I'm in no way going to attempt to paint this technique on all of it. Just enough to kind of test the theory. So again, on the how many drops thing, when I'm mixing paints for layering, I will sometimes do the X drops to Y drops. Like, I did this roughly half and half. But you'll see what just happened here. This does not look halfway between those two colors. This color is apparently a much stronger color. We'd say it has a stronger tinting strength than this color. So what I'm looking for is a nice step from, darker, a little less darker, middle tone, a little lighter, a little lighter, a little lighter. I'm not looking for a formula of there's X amount of this color and Y amount of that color. So I think that's a little close. It's still a little dark, I think. And you'll have that with some colors where you can, one drop of this and it takes like 5 drops of another color to equal them. It's just some colors have more of that tinting strength. Okay. So again, since this is a somewhat larger figure, I'm trying to figure out which section I'm going to paint, since I know I'm not going to be able to paint like a ton of it. And I'm going to do this as kind of a rough block-in type wet blending. This wouldn't necessarily be, this is my final perfect result type thing. This method of painting does take much longer than dry brushing and washing, which is why not everybody wants to do it, understandably. I mean, I don't know exactly how long the nice snake that I painted, the example one that I painted took, but it was many hours. And some fitzing and putzing. But right now I'm just trying to get the idea of whether the colors work. Then if they, and this, you want to do this. When people talk about doing a sketch or blocking in or roughing it in, and European painters in particular talk about this a lot. This is what they mean. They don't want to spend 10 hours or 5 hours or even 1 hour to get something like this that they don't like. They want to block something in quickly to get an idea of whether these colors work together or if they need to shift gears and go get other colors. So the fact that I'm not going to devote the same attention to this that I did to the original snake does not invalidate the method of testing. it in fact kind of is the method of testing. And I mean, very likely I will just finish this up at an okay level and give this to my husband to use when we play D&D. And, you know, at such time when we can start having people over again. Right now we're playing online, of course. And I think I'm already starting to get the idea that these colors work together just fine using this method of painting. I might end up going a little darker. I might end up, you know, maybe I would bring in some of a more saturated yellow. That is what I ended up doing, I think, on this snake. The real snake, there are places where there is more saturated yellow color where it's in the light to make it more interesting. But in terms of, is this ugly? I don't think it's ugly. So these colors work using a different technique. So that indeed was one way to solve the problem. And I'll let this guy dry a little more and then show him again too. And now let's look at the wash snake. And it's unfortunate that it now looks so much darker because it's really not that much darker. But hopefully you can still sort of see. Unfortunately, the wash is not quite dry. I may pause the video briefly to dry the wash so that we can go on to the next stage and do the dry brushing. So I'm back and my the wash on my snake is dry now. And I think I'm already pretty confident that, you know, that more of a brown than a, you know, a less reddy brown works. But, you know, I'm not 100% sure. It makes a difference what it looks like when we do the dry brushing step. So let's do that and see what we get. I'm going to use big fluffy brushes. So I think I'll use this one. These are makeup brushes. I've really been enjoying these for doing dry brushing lately. You get a bit nicer of a result and it's easier and quicker. So I will briefly, let me get my lid. I'll just use this so that you can see what I'm doing with the brush at the same time. We'll get a fresh section of paper towel. So this was my original starting color, the oil leather. I'll get my brush in there. You can see it doesn't take that long to get it off either, and I'll probably put more paint on than I need to. And I'm going to use a very light touch. And I used, I don't know if I used this exact brush, but I used a similar brush to paint the snake I didn't like. So this is not changing a variable. Just going to move this over. It's probably not as interesting as watching me paint. And you can see that the load lasts a good while with these soft brushes. I'll be talking about this a little more probably at my Reaper Virtual Expo class, and also for members of my Patreon. I have posted videos of a class I did on painting feathers and scales, and another class I did on painting fur, where I talked more about these brushes. So I'm not going to go nuts talking about that here because this video is about solving problems and testing theories. So I'll just concentrate on the same part of the snake that I was concentrating on with the other painting method, and we won't worry about the other part. So that's using the original base coat mid-tone color. So so now let's go to this blonde shadow. Keep it where you can see it in focus, but it's also important for me to have some idea where I'm putting the paint, because I'm wacky like that. So that was the first highlight color that I used on my original snake, and then is that the only? I think I added a little more. Yeah, I definitely added more. I can see that it's lighter. Now that is a bit more of a jump, but I think that's what I did on the original snake, so I'm just going to go with it. I think doing a mix would probably give a nicer result, but this is meant to be, you know, a tabletop. Get us fighting this snake quickly type of paint job, so I don't want to go nuts and make you guys wait forever while you watch me dry brushing a snake, which is probably not the most fascinating thing you could do with your day. All right, I think that is probably enough for testing purposes. So I'm gonna just clean up this section a little and come back and kind of do a final thoughts. Okay, so I'm back, and now I've got a whole parade of snakes. So what have I learned, if anything? So let's review what I was doing. I painted this snake, and I didn't like it. And I wanted to try to figure out why I didn't like it. What had I got wrong, so I could try to avoid getting that wrong in the future. And I came up with two different theories. One was that I had used the wrong color, or a color that didn't work as well for the wash. And the other theory is that I could make that selection of colors work, but by using a different application method. So instead of doing a wash that would apply that color all over the figure, doing something more like wet blending or layering that applied the colors in selective areas, which is how this snake is painted. So these guys were with washing and dry brushing. So I knew that I could do washing and dry brushing that worked. It was just how to make it work. So to test those two theories, I used the same color selection for this snake with a different wash color on this one, and I used the same colors I used on this one. So on this one, I applied the colors the way I applied here, and this one I had a different wash color. And I would say the testing suggests that I was correct. Either one of those solutions would work. The main root problem was the wash that I used. Because that's the problem, I don't know that there's much I could do to fix this particular snake. Maybe I'll switch back to my palette in a minute and see if we can try something. But I'm not sure there's much I could do to fix this snake. It may just be a case of me knowing, well, now I should be sure, maybe it's worth taking the time to do wash tests before I paint a whole large snake like that. Because I could repaint this, and I don't think it would fill in the detail too much. I think people sometimes get a little too concerned about that. If your paint is fluid enough that it's not adding texture to the figure, you can probably go 2 or 3 times even on something textured. This, in fact, is the second paint job on these wings. There was another color underneath, and you can still see the fine sculpted detail. But you do want to avoid it if you can, and particularly if you're painting figures that have finer sculpted textures. You know, it's probably worth the time to test rather than have to paint something over and over again. So hopefully that was helpful to you in seeing an insight of how to analyze problems and check for solutions and do experiments, and how you can use left brain thinking processes on a right brain activity like art, and it can work very well to your advantage. So before I wrap up the video, I actually thought, why don't I go ahead and see if there's anything I could do to fix this a little. So my first suggestion, I think, would be to try to add more of the mid-tone color back, or the original base coat color. I feel like if I compare this to the one I just worked on, I can see a lot more of the paint in the crevices. So maybe I don't know what I did differently, if anything, but it's worth a shot to see if that's the problem. So I'm going to use, it's a similar brush, but that other one, I put it in water so that it wouldn't dry out while I was talking to you, so it's too wet to use as a dry brush very easily. So this is probably going to look weird because I'm going over, you know, I had lighter color on here as well that I'm now going over. And I need more of my wild leather. So I think I will do a similar thing and just work on this back section instead of trying to do the whole figure on camera, because that would be boring for you guys to watch. I probably didn't get enough paint off there. And I'm actually trying to get a little, I'm not trying to cover up all the crevices, but I'm trying to get a little more coverage than I had initially to test that theory of whether part of the problem was just that too much was showing. And I hadn't, you know, that initial, this initial step of bringing back the mid-tone color, that maybe I hadn't done enough of that. And I think that is looking better. So let's go up to the next color. Switch to a different section so you can still see some of that. So I'm going to apply this with a bit of a lighter hand because now I really don't want to get too much in the crevices. Lightest color, and we'll add some of that, and that I'm going to apply a little more judiciously just to the areas that would be receiving the most light. Sorry, I'm concerned that he's not going to be in focus, and also that I can't see what I'm doing. But I mean, it is just a dry brush snake. I don't have to see everything that's happening here, just the big picture. So there's that. Let me just get his buddies back and we'll do another comparison. Okay, so I'm back again. I do think that helped. If you look at this section compared to this section, or maybe we'll look at the back, flip them around, look at the front. It's better, but I do still find, and even more on camera than in person, that red in the crevices is just too intense and distracting, that the brown looks better. So the brown, using more of a brown and more of a reddish brown, in the shadows made a big difference. But a reddish approach works if the other, if the middle color is more orange and the highlight color is more yellow, that works too. It was that combination of the mid-tone color and the highlight color were less saturated, and the shadow color was more saturated. So there's my 3 experiments. Well, there's the one that failed and the 2 experiments for how to do it better. So thank you for watching. I hope you found that somewhat interesting or informative, or something that could give you some ideas for how to solve problems you may be having with your painting. And if you like this kind of video version of things that I write on my blog, let me know and I'll see if I can do more of it. Thank you for watching.